August 30th, 1945. The vast Pacific stretched out, a slate-gray expanse under a wind-whipped sky. The ocean's surface, flattened and still. And at its edge, a war that had finally drawn to a close. Aboard a United States Navy transport vessel, a small group of Japanese women stood together, their thin garments offering little protection against the breeze. Their eyes were wide with a mixture of apprehension and wonder, their bodies swaying gently with the ship's motion. Among them were nurses, once stationed on remote Pacific islands, now prisoners of war. Others had been clerks or civilian women caught in the sweeping tide of surrender. Their complexions were pale, their dark hair knotted loosely, and their expressions spoke of a profound weariness, the heavy burden of a defeated nation. They had grown up with vivid posters that depicted Americans as savage beasts, fiends with sharp claws and predatory fangs. Yet, here they were, under the watchful eyes of young men in crisply pressed khaki uniforms. These men spoke with unfamiliar cadences and exhibited an unexpected gentleness. Instead of scorn or aggression, they offered cigarettes or water, treating the women as if they were mere travelers, not vanquished foes. The women struggled to reconcile this scene with the dire warnings they had absorbed for years through relentless propaganda. The ship creaked and groaned as it navigated towards the American coast, carrying the immense weight of their nation's capitulation across the ocean. Initially, the women remained silent, standing close together, their breaths misting in the cool morning air. Some tightly clutched their few remaining possessions: worn satchels, faded photographs, a silk kimono carefully folded and hidden beneath military-issue blankets. Each woman carried not just these physical tokens, but the indelible story of her own survival through capture. One, a nurse of 28 years, had served in a field hospital on Saipan. She recounted the harrowing experience of witnessing her colleagues choose a desperate leap from cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. Another, a mere 21 years of age, had been employed as a typist in an administrative office when United States troops descended upon the island. A third, older than the rest, had been tending to children at a missionary outpost when the surrender encompassed them all in its sweep of captivity. Their individual paths to this moment were distinct, yet they shared a common dread: the uncertainty of what awaited them in the enemy's territory. The American sailors on board were remarkably young, many no older than the women themselves. They hailed from diverse backgrounds: sons of Iowa farms, steel workers from Pennsylvania, baseball enthusiasts from Texas, now serving as sailors and guards. They moved across the deck with an easy confidence, rifles slung casually, their lips occasionally parting in fleeting smiles as their gazes met those of the bewildered women. One soldier, a hint of amusement in his eyes, extended a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, tapping it with 2 fingers before offering it like a gesture of peace. The women instinctively drew back, suspicious of a potential trick. When one of them finally reached out, her hand trembling, the soldier simply nodded and lit the cigarette for her. It was a small act, yet it chipped away at the formidable wall of fear that years of indoctrination had erected. These were not the monsters they had been led to believe in. They were, disquietingly, simply men. The sea voyage was protracted, and the passage of time aboard the transport became a blur. Meals arrived with predictable regularity: trays laden with bread, bowls of soup, and occasionally a serving of meat. The women were astonished by the sheer abundance, though for some, nerves made swallowing impossible. The nights grew colder, the bunks hard and unforgiving, and hushed whispers filled the darkness as they attempted to comprehend their destination. Rumors circulated among them, perhaps California or even Texas, names that sounded foreign and vast. None had ever seen America, though many knew of it as a land characterized by arrogance, towering skyscrapers, and relentless industrial machinery. The notion of themselves within such a place was as inconceivable as imagining peace after years of relentless air raids and stringent rationing. Yet, the most unsettling realization stemmed not from fear of the unknown, but from the very appearance of the Americans themselves. Compared to the men they knew in Japan, gaunt from rice shortages and etched with the ravages of conflict, the Americans seemed impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, and brimming with vitality. Their uniforms fit them with ease, their boots gleamed, and their laughter seemed to carry above the constant drone of the sea. Secretly, the women observed them, marveling at their evident health. They had been taught that Americans were decadent and feeble, softened by a life of luxury. But these men, with their clear eyes and athletic physiques, appeared anything but weak. This stark contradiction unsettled them profoundly, a silent erosion of their ingrained beliefs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, the nurse from Saipan stood at the railing, gazing towards the distant line where water met sky. A young American sailor, barely over 20, stood a short distance away, smoking a cigarette. For a long time, they shared the quiet, two souls from vastly different worlds. When the sailor finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. "You'll be safe there." She did not grasp the specific words, but the sentiment conveyed by his tone was clear. There was no menace, no hatred, perhaps even a flicker of kindness. She quickly turned away, unnerved by the genuine humanity in his voice. Within the confines of the cabins, conversations grew bolder. One young woman confided that the guards resembled actors from American films she had glimpsed before the war. Another remarked that their smiles seemed unsettlingly open, even frightening in their freedom. A third admitted that the towering soldiers made her feel insignificant, like a child. Nervous laughter rippled through the group, but beneath it lay a profound unease. If everything they had been told about the enemy was a fabrication, what other truths had been distorted? If the enemy was not grotesque but handsome, not vicious but courteous, then what had been the true cost of their suffering? Their minds wrestled with questions they could not yet articulate. The days unfolded, marked by the clang of bells and the serving of meals, the ceaseless whisper of the ocean. Gradually, the women began to adapt, though fear never entirely receded. They started to notice the smaller details, the way the Americans playfully teased one another, the cheerful whistling of a tune while a guard polished his boots, the quiet reverence of another as he offered a nightly prayer, his head bowed. These seemingly ordinary acts held an extraordinary power. The women had been braced for cruelty, but instead, they witnessed the simple rituals of everyday life. It was disarming, confusing, and paradoxically painful, for it brought to mind what their own brothers and husbands might have been like had war not consumed their existence. On the morning of August 30th, the distant shoreline finally materialized. First a faint smudge, then a discernible shape, and finally the unmistakable outline of the American continent. The women pressed against the railings, their hearts quickening. For some, the familiar surge of fear returned. What trials awaited them in this immense foreign land? For others, a spark of curiosity ignited. The tall guards stood nearby, their gazes also directed homeward, their postures relaxed, as if they were merely returning from a long shift rather than concluding a global conflict. The contrast was almost overwhelming. These women, prisoners of war, were sailing towards a land they had been taught to despise, a land that would now determine their futures. Yet, standing beside them were men whose very presence challenged every warning and caricature they had held dear. The ship let out a low groan as it approached the harbor, seagulls circling overhead, the air growing sharper with the distinct scent of land. One of the women, clutching her worn satchel, whispered to the nurse beside her, "If they are not monsters, then what are they?" It was a question laden with both profound dread and a dawning sense of wonder. The nurse had no immediate answer. She could only stare at the American docks rising from the horizon, where more soldiers stood waiting, taller, broader, and more impeccably groomed than she had ever imagined. Her pulse quickened. The ocean voyage was drawing to a close, but the far greater journey was just beginning. For what awaited them on American soil was not barbarity, but something far more peculiar and, perhaps, even more profoundly unsettling. The harbor emerged from the mist like a harbinger, simultaneously a promise and a threat. Wooden piers extended into the water, and massive cranes swung lazily overhead. The mingled scents of oil, salt, and coal drifted towards the transport ship as it eased closer to the shore. For the Japanese women observing from the deck, every detail etched itself indelibly into their memories. They tightened their grips on their satchels and peered through the haze at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms immaculate, their rifles held with casual readiness, their stances firm but devoid of menace. A collective intake of breath swept through the women. This was their first true glimpse of America, and it bore no resemblance to the grotesque caricatures that had filled their wartime newspapers. In those publications, the enemy had been depicted as hunched, animalistic figures, their faces contorted with malice. Yet here, bathed in sunlight, the Americans were tall, clean-cut, and broad-shouldered. Their hair gleamed in shades rarely seen in Japan: brown, blonde, even fiery red. Their jawlines were sharp, and their eyes were strikingly clear. They did not appear emaciated or sickly. Rather, they exuded strength, as if born from a land of unparalleled abundance. One young woman whispered to her companion, her voice trembling as if confessing a grave transgression, "They are handsome." The word felt perilous on her tongue, as though acknowledging their attractiveness was a betrayal of something sacred. But her companions heard her, and though no one spoke aloud, their silence conveyed a quiet, shared understanding. The guards on board barked orders in English, signaling the women to prepare for disembarkation. Boots clanged on metal stairways, ropes were secured, and the ship shuddered as it nudged against the pier. One by one, the women descended the gangway, their heads bowed, yet their eyes darted forward, stealing furtive glances at the soldiers lining their path. The Americans towered over them. The average Japanese man in the 1940s stood little more than 5 feet, 3 inches. These guards, nourished by a diet of beef and milk, were easily 5 feet, 8 inches, 5 feet, 9 inches, and some even taller. The women acutely felt the disparity, not just in height, but in the palpable self-assurance of their demeanor. It was as if they had stepped into a realm where men were giants. The Americans watched silently, some with polite curiosity, others with detached observation. A few exchanged hushed words, but there was no cruelty in their eyes, no hint of mockery. One soldier, no older than 20, shifted his weight nervously when a Japanese nurse met his gaze. Their eyes locked for a fleeting instant, and she felt a warmth rise to her face. The shame of it startled her. How could she even notice such a thing? A prisoner in this place. She quickly looked away, yet the image of his face, clean-shaven, unblemished, impossibly youthful, remained seared into her thoughts. At the foot of the gangway, the women were ushered into orderly rows. Trucks waited nearby, their engines rumbling, ready to transport them inland. American officers moved among them, meticulously checking lists and counting softly. The entire process was efficient, almost clinical, yet beneath the surface lay an unexpected element, a subtle courtesy. One officer gestured for a woman to adjust her satchel to prevent it from slipping, his hand carefully avoiding any physical contact. Another spoke slowly, pointing to the truck she should board, his tone patient and clear. These actions starkly contradicted every narrative circulating in Japan, where the enemy was rumored to spit on captives and treat them worse than livestock. The women's hearts pounded with the sheer strangeness of it all. As the trucks jolted forward, the city unfolded before them. Streets stretched wide, flanked by warehouses and cranes. The sky was streaked with soot, but interspersed were the sharp, brilliant hues of neon signs, their English letters glowing in colors they could barely decipher. Cars glided past, their engines running smoothly, their chrome gleaming. America, even in a port still bearing the marks of wartime industry, appeared vibrant and energetic. The women pressed their faces against the slats of the truck beds, utterly astonished. In Japan, cities lay in ruins. Tokyo was a field of ash, Osaka a scorched landscape, Nagoya a shattered testament to destruction. Here, buildings stood tall, and the rhythm of industry hummed as if the war had merely brushed past without inflicting lasting damage. The nurse from Saipan thought of her younger brother, who had succumbed to malnutrition 2 years prior. She recalled his slender frame, his thin wrists, and the way hunger had dulled his eyes. Then she looked again at the Americans driving their trucks, broad backs, thick arms, laughter spilling easily between them. A knot formed in her stomach, a complex mixture of envy, grief, and profound wonder. If the enemy had lived lives of such apparent ease and abundance, had they truly experienced the same war? The trucks rumbled onward, heading inland towards the camps that awaited them. Along the route, American civilians caught sight of the convoy. Children, their feet bare, stood by the roadside, waving with uninhibited curiosity. Some adults watched quietly, arms folded, neither welcoming nor hostile, but merely cautious. The women shrank from their gazes, but what startled them most was not animosity. It was the pervasive indifference. They were not considered spectacles to be taunted or paraded. They were simply another consequence of the war. This anonymity offered both a sense of relief and a sharp sting. To be invisible was safer, yet it also underscored their complete loss of power. Inside the truck, a new wave of whispers spread. A 21-year-old clerk leaned towards the nurse, her voice barely audible. "They look like film stars." The nurse frowned, but the younger woman's eyes shone with a nervous awe. An older woman softly chided, "Do not speak of such things." Yet, even she could not deny the shared sentiment. The men around them, clean, tall, and composed, were nothing like the distorted figures of propaganda. They were, in a way that deeply unsettled them, even admirable. The convoy reached the outskirts of the countryside. Fields stretched far and wide, a tapestry of green and gold beneath the sun. Farmhouses dotted the landscape, their porches adorned with rocking chairs, their barns painted a vibrant red. The women stared in silent contemplation. This, too, was America. Fertile, untouched by firebombing, a land that seemed to draw strength directly from its soil. The contrast with their own villages, scorched and desolate, was almost unbearable. Some felt a stinging in their eyes, though they quickly brushed away the tears. By the time the truck slowed at the camp gates, the women's minds were a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. They had been prepared for cruelty, yet had encountered courtesy. They had been warned of monsters, only to find men who resembled athletes, farmers, and actors. They had envisioned America as a desolate expanse of arrogance, yet now saw fields and cities miraculously preserved. Each glimpse of abundance amplified the weight of their own losses. Each tall soldier served as a poignant reminder of brothers buried in unmarked graves. As they were led through the gates, one final scene struck them with particular force. The American guards exchanged laughter amongst themselves, casually tossing a baseball back and forth while awaiting their next orders. The ball arced high in the afternoon light, caught effortlessly by hands that seemed untouched by the ravages of war. The women paused for a moment, observing the scene. To them, it was more than a mere game. It was a testament to something both terrifying and alluring. America had preserved its vigor and vitality, while Japan had crumbled into ashes. The nurse clutched her satchel, her gaze fixed on the ball as it soared through the air once more. For the first time, she felt the profound weight of the question that gnawed at all of them. If everything they had believed to be true was false, what new truths would this land compel them to confront? The ball snapped into the soldier's glove with a soft thud, and the women were gently urged forward. What lay within the camp would challenge them even more profoundly than the sight of handsome men on the docks. The gates clanged shut behind them, but what awaited them was not the grim utilitarian barracks they had envisioned. The American camp sprawled across gently rolling fields, its wooden huts arranged neatly and symmetrically, akin to rows of farm buildings, and its fences, though tall, did not convey a sense of menace. Guards patrolled the perimeter, with their rifles resting casually on their shoulders, their expressions suggesting boredom rather than brutality. The women clutched their satchels tightly and stepped onto gravel paths that crunched beneath their feet, their hearts pounding with a sense of disbelief. They had anticipated darkness, harshness, and confinement. Instead, they discovered order, cleanliness, and a faint, enticing aroma of baking bread wafting from the kitchens. On their first morning, they were roused not by shouts, but by the melodious chime of a bell that echoed through the camp, reminiscent of a schoolyard. They lined up hesitantly for breakfast. Each tray overflowed with provisions that seemed almost unthinkable after years of scarcity. Scrambled eggs, thick slices of buttered bread, and even sizzling bacon served on tin plates. The younger women gazed at the food, struggling to believe it was truly theirs. One nurse whispered to the clerk beside her, "This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo." The clerk could only nod, her eyes welling with tears. For months, their sustenance had consisted of thin rice gruel and boiled weeds. Here, in the heart of the enemy's land, they were presented with more than they had ever dared to dream of. Some wept silently as they ate, overcome with shame that their first tears in captivity were not born of suffering, but of an unexpected kindness. Life within the camp settled into an unexpected rhythm. Each day followed a clear schedule: meals, roll calls, medical examinations, and work assignments for those who volunteered. The women were issued uniforms of plain fabric, neither demeaning nor harsh, simply durable clothing suitable for manual tasks. They were housed in separate barracks from the men, their quarters furnished with wooden bunks and thin mattresses. At night, hushed whispers filled the darkness, conversations filled with questions about home, fragmented memories, and confessions of utter disbelief. They spoke of husbands lost to the war, of brothers who had marched into distant jungles and never returned, of children they might never see again. And always, beneath the surface of their grief, lay the pervasive astonishment. Why were they being treated with such dignity in the land of their conquerors? The Americans, too, seemed somewhat uncertain in their roles. Guards approached the women with politeness, distributing soap, demonstrating the location of the showers, and patiently explaining, often through gestures, how to operate unfamiliar amenities. One soldier chuckled gently when a woman stared in open wonder at the stream of hot water gushing from a faucet. "It's just plumbing," he remarked, unaware of the profound significance of such basic conveniences for those who had endured years of rationing. On another occasion, when one woman struggled to carry a heavy crate, a guard stepped forward, taking it from her grasp with a sheepish smile. The interaction was brief, but afterward she confided to her companions, "I thought he would strike me. Instead, he helped." This daily paradox continued to challenge them, forcing them to unlearn deeply ingrained beliefs that they had once considered unshakable. Not all moments within the camp were gentle. The women remained prisoners, constantly under surveillance, their movements restricted. The fences served as a perpetual reminder of their status with every glance, and the guards' rifles were never far from sight. However, cruelty was not the defining characteristic of the place. Instead, what set it apart was a peculiar synthesis of abundance and restraint, as if the Americans had determined that victory was best demonstrated not through retribution, but by showcasing their own inherent strength. They provided sustenance, clean housing, and opportunities for work, subtle assertions of power that conveyed a clear message: we are powerful enough to afford mercy. One afternoon, the women were gathered in the yard as American soldiers engaged in a game of catch with a baseball, their laughter rising freely into the warm air. The women watched, captivated by the effortless grace of their movements. Their own brothers had played with rudimentary bats and balls fashioned from scraps of cloth before the war. But here, the game appeared almost instinctive, an integral part of the daily lives of men untouched by hunger. The clerk whispered, "It is like watching another world." She was not wrong. For the prisoners, the camp served less as a prison and more as a mirror, reflecting the profound chasm that separated their respective worlds. The nurse from Saipan found herself studying the faces of the guards when they believed themselves unobserved. They were sun-kissed, some even freckled, their jaws square, and their teeth startlingly white compared to the emaciated men she had tended to in the field hospitals. She thought of her fiancé, who had gone to sea in 1943 and never returned. He had been thin, his complexion sallow, his shoulders narrow from a lack of adequate nourishment. The men before her now appeared like giants. She despised herself for noticing these details, yet she could not stop. The stark contrast felt like a wound that refused to heal. Letters arrived for the American soldiers, delivered in neat stacks. The women observed as the soldiers unfolded envelopes, their faces breaking into smiles, some wiping away tears before tucking photographs into their shirt pockets. Family seemed incredibly close for them, present even across vast oceans. For the Japanese women, family was now a matter of memory alone, fading and irretrievable. This divide felt more profound than the physical fences surrounding the camp, and yet, amidst the sorrow, small connections began to bloom. When one woman, in halting English, expressed gratitude to a soldier for an extra bar of soap, he responded with exaggerated politeness, tipping his cap, as if addressing a lady of high standing. She found herself laughing, the first genuine laughter to escape her since her capture. Another day, a tempest descended upon the encampment, prompting the sentinels to hasten in, securing portals and coverings, one barking directives as if safeguarding his personal abode. The women lent their aid as well, transporting what they could, surprised by the shared urgency. For a fleeting interval, those who held sway and those who were held prisoner labored conjointly against the gale, and the recollection endured. Dispatches from the International Red Cross chronicled the remarkable leniency observed in American detainment facilities, juxtaposing them with the atrocious accounts emanating from Japanese internment centers scattered throughout Asia. The women remained unaware of these reports, yet they experienced their veracity in their quotidian existence. Soap, sustenance, pristine linens, they encountered a world turned on its head. Compassion itself became disorienting. Some remained awake through the nocturnal hours, questioning if it was a ploy, if barbarity would manifest later. Others murmured that perhaps the Americans were entirely unlike the narratives they had received. The days stretched on, and the initial shock gradually yielded to an unsettling familiarity. The women grew accustomed to the cadence of camp existence, the flavor of refined flour bread, the comforting warmth of heated ablutions, the resonance of spheres impacting protective gear. Nevertheless, beneath this newfound normalcy, a persistent query throbbed. What was the import of their adversaries treating them with greater consideration than their own military sometimes had? If conflict was erected upon falsehoods, what verities remained to be embraced? One evening, as twilight cast a violet hue across the heavens, the medical attendant tarried near the perimeter, gazing at the guards silhouetted against the diminishing sun. Their jovial exclamations drifted across the grounds, unburdened, vibrant. A profound ache resonated within her, not solely of sorrow, but of something more elusive to articulate, a dawning realization that the world was vaster, more intricate than she had ever conceived. She placed her hand against the coarse wood of the barracks wall, steadying herself as an unbidden contemplation took root. Perhaps the genuine confinement resided not within these barriers, but within the deceits she had carried into them. And yet, as darkness enveloped the land, a new whisper circulated amongst the women, murmured tidings foretelling that the morrow would usher in something even more astonishing, a revelation that would disturb them more profoundly than bread, more than soap, even more than the sight of comely sentinels. They lay in their cots, listening to the faint hum of American voices, their hearts quickening with anticipation of what they might uncover with the dawn. Winter descended upon the compound, softening the sharp edges of the barracks with frost, muffling the clang of the gates with snow. The women drew their issued cloaks tighter, their exhalations misting in pale plumes, and traversed the yard where sentinels now stamped their boots to ward off the chill. Months had elapsed since their arrival, months since the vessel first revealed the astonishing sight of towering American servicemen on the quay. In that interim, their apprehension had transmuted into a more acute, more complex perception. They were still confined, still held by the fences, yet they had begun to perceive the men surrounding them less as anonymous foes and more as young lives mirroring their own. The nurse frequently paused by the kitchen casement, observing soldiers unloading sacks of flour or crates of fruit. She contemplated her betrothed, lost to the ocean's depths, and experienced a sorrow amplified by the palpable vitality of the men before her. They whistled as they toiled, tossing apples to one another, as if the world had remained untouched by conflagration. She found herself ambivalent, unsure whether the spectacle offered solace or unbearable torment. Her heart grappled with inherent contradictions, the animosity instilled by warfare, the gratitude born of survival, and a peculiar, reluctant admiration for the adversary who had not subjugated them, but provided for them. Evenings within the barracks grew more subdued, though hushed conversations still permeated the darkness. One woman confessed to dreaming of her captors, not nightmarish visions of cruelty, but dreams wherein they were simply men, their laughter echoing through the compound. Another admitted that she no longer knew whether to cling to the animosity ingrained within her or to acknowledge the beneficence she had experienced through sustenance and hygiene. A sense of shame lingered in their pronouncements, yet so too did a feeling of relief. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, yet it profoundly altered the atmosphere they breathed. The Americans, too, appeared to undergo a shift. Certain guards had initially interacted with the women with rigid decorum, wary of any closeness. Over time, minor acts began to bridge the divide. A soldier would sketch rudimentary floral designs on discarded paper and leave them near the laundry facility. Another would impart a few English phrases to a woman. "Good morning, thank you," chuckling when she mimicked them with awkward pronunciation. These were not grand gestures of camaraderie, but mere fragments of shared humanity that pierced the chasm of war. The women cherished these fragments like concealed treasures. Official accounts documented the unusual civility of such facilities. The International Red Cross, during its inspections in 1945 and 1946, reported American adherence to the Geneva Convention, starkly contrasting this with narratives from Japanese camps where disease and barbarity were prevalent. The women never perused these documents, but they lived their truth each day. Every bar of soap, every serving of food, every simple act of kindness served as evidence against the propaganda that had shaped their reality. The deceptions of the past crumbled silently, supplanted by experiences they could not dispute. Yet, this metamorphosis was not without its attendant pain. Each manifestation of American prosperity, well-nourished bodies, immaculate uniforms, effortless laughter, also served as a somber reminder of Japan's desolation. Their homeland lay in ruins. Families struggled for sustenance. Brothers and fathers had perished, emaciated and broken. To witness their captors flourish while their own kin suffered was an agony difficult to endure. The women carried that sorrow as if it were a second skin. Gratitude for kindness coexisted with resentment over defeat. Both were heavy, both were valid. The nurse once stood by the fence as a guard meticulously penned a letter to his family. His pencil moved with steady strokes, his lips subtly forming words with each inscription. When he paused, gazing toward the distant horizon, she wondered about the recipient, a spouse, a sweetheart, a mother. She thought of the correspondence she would never dispatch, the countenances she would never behold again. A bitter truth struck her with force. This man, her captor, might experience more joy and tranquility in his lifetime than her fiancé ever had. She turned away swiftly, but the thought persisted, a haunting presence. Seasons transitioned, and the echoes of conflict softened into reminiscence. The women began to measure time less by apprehension and more by small, established routines. They would meticulously sweep their quarters, fold their garments with care, and attend to one another during periods of infirmity. Some engaged in labor within the camp's cultivated plots, planting rows of produce under the watchful gaze of the guards. For them, the sensation of touching soil again felt akin to reconnecting with life itself. It lent structure to days that otherwise blurred into an undifferentiated continuum, and always above the routine loomed the imposing figures of the American servicemen, living testament that the world was not as they had been led to believe. One afternoon, a soldier brought a phonograph into the yard. He wound its mechanism, and music spilled forth, swing rhythms, vibrant and brassy. The women froze, taken aback by the unfamiliar, infectious sound. Some managed to smile despite themselves. A few guards tapped their feet in tempo, exchanging jesting remarks. The nurse closed her eyes, absorbing the melody, and felt a prickling sensation at the corners of her eyes. Music, of all things, reminded her that gaiety still existed, even within confinement. Its beauty was almost painfully exquisite. Yet, it became indelibly etched in her memory as a moment when the fortifications of animosity momentarily yielded, allowing a sliver of humanity to pass through. By springtime, murmurs of liberation began to circulate. The war had long since concluded, and repatriation loomed. For many women, the prospect of returning to Japan was tinged with a complex mix of emotions. They yearned for their homeland, yet dreaded what it had become. News filtered in, detailing rubble, widespread hunger, and profound sorrow. To depart the camp meant confronting a nation irrevocably altered by defeat. Strangely for some, the fences no longer felt exclusively like a prison. They felt like a sanctuary from a harsher reality awaiting them beyond. As the day of their departure drew nearer, the women gathered their meager possessions. They folded their coats, secured their bundles, and once again formed ranks for transport. The nurse cast a final glance back at the compound. The barracks stood silent, the fences remained imposing, and the guards continued their vigil. Yet, in her recollection, it was not the fences that remained sharpest. It was the aroma of fried pork belly in the mornings, the warmth of the showers, the courteous interactions, the tall soldiers tossing a baseball in the sun. These specific details would accompany her long after the gates had closed behind her. As the transport vehicles rumbled towards the port, the women exchanged whispered confidences, not of monsters, but of men. They looked like film stars, one reiterated. This time, without humiliation, another added softly. They treated us better than we had anticipated. The nurse remained reticent, her gaze fixed upon the road ahead. She felt an internal recalibration, not toward affection or admiration, but toward something weightier. the dawning comprehension that truth had proven far more intricate than she had ever imagined. Warfare had been constructed upon fabrications, but within captivity she had glimpsed something irrefutable. At the harbor, the ships awaited, imposing gray vessels poised to convey them back to the ashes of Japan. The women boarded, their satchels clutched tightly, their hearts rent. Behind them, America receded, a land of paradoxes, of defeat and unexpected clemency, of tall, handsome men who had irrevocably shattered every narrative they had been told. As the ship's engines roared to life, the nurse clasped her hands together and uttered a silent plea, not for triumph, nor for retribution, but for comprehension. She had no certainty of what awaited her in her native land, but she knew one truth would remain with her eternally. The enemy had met her gaze and treated her as a fellow human, and that memory, simultaneously poignant and luminous, would not diminish.